My mother-in-law sold my 11-year-old son's inheritance ring, a $1.8 million piece his grandmother left him in a legally binding will, and spent the money on cosmetic surgery. At the funeral reception, surrounded by family and canapés, and the smell of lilies that I will always associate with that particular flavor of betrayal, she stood up and announced that he was too young to appreciate it anyway. She said it like she was doing everyone a favor. Like she had solved a problem nobody asked her to solve. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and handed the lawyer an envelope I had been carrying for 6 weeks. He opened it. He read aloud. The ring was actually. And then the police arrived. Some people in my family still think I went too far. After everything you are about to hear, I genuinely want to know what you think. To understand how a woman can stand in a funeral reception hall and feel completely, surgically calm while the world restructures itself around her, you need to understand the 4 years that came before that moment. You need to understand Dorothea Quan Hartley, my mother-in-law, and what she believed about women like me, and why she was so profoundly, catastrophically wrong. Let me take you back to where this actually started. I married Roland Hartley 9 years before that funeral reception. We met at a conference in San Diego. I was there representing the firm I worked for at the time. He was a keynote speaker, and we discovered over dinner that we were both the kind of people who read contracts for fun. It was, in retrospect, a warning sign that I ignored because he was charming and tall and laughed at the same things I did. We were married 14 months later, in a small ceremony that Dorothea attended wearing a hat that cost more than my dress, which she made sure I knew. Roland's family had money the old-fashioned way, inherited, carefully managed, and deeply, spiritually important to everyone involved. His grandmother, Cecile Ackeffer Hartley, was the matriarch, the woman who had actually built the family's original wealth through a textiles business in the 1970s, and she was the only member of that family who ever looked at me without calculating something. She called me sharp. She meant it as the highest compliment. Dorothea, who had married into the Hartley name rather than being born into it, had spent 30 years working very hard to be considered its keeper, and she did not appreciate a daughter-in-law who might complicate that project. Roland and I had our son, Elliot, 2 years into the marriage. Cecile held him at the hospital and said, "This one has her eyes. Good, he'll need them." Dorothea was in the corner arranging flowers that nobody had asked her to bring. The pattern that defined the next 9 years established itself almost immediately after Elliot was born. I worked in financial consulting. I had built a client base over 8 years that was, by any reasonable measure, substantial, but because I worked from home 3 days a week and drove a practical car and did not wear my professional identity on my body the way Dorothea wore hers, the Hartley family had collectively decided I was a pleasant addition to the household who was probably good with numbers, the way someone is good at Sudoku. Decorative competence. Harmless. Dorothea set the tone. She was not cruel in obvious ways. She was too smart for that, and too aware of how it would look. She was cruel in the way that requires an audience that's in on the joke. She would ask about my little projects at family dinners in a voice that suggested she was being generous by inquiring. She would turn to Roland mid-conversation and say things like, "You should make sure she has help with the accounting, darling. It can be so overwhelming." As though I were not sitting 18 inches to her left with a CPA certification and a master's degree in financial analysis. She had a signature tell when she was condescending. She would touch the pearl brooch on her lapel, just a brush of her fingertips, as though confirming it was still there, still hers, still proof of something. I watched her do it hundreds of times. It became a kind of metronome for the particular music she played. There were 3 incidents in those early years that I still carry with me, not because they hurt, though some of them did, but because each one taught me something precise about what I was dealing with. The first happened 18 months after Elliot was born. Dorothea hosted the family for Christmas at her home in Connecticut, and at the dinner table she produced a job listing, printed, folded, slid across the table like a bribe, for an administrative coordinator position at her country club. "The hours are manageable for a young mother," she said, touching her brooch, "and the benefits are quite decent." Roland looked at his plate. His sister, Felicia, looked at the ceiling. Neither of them said a word. I folded the listing carefully and tucked it in my bag. I thanked her. That night, after Elliot was asleep and Roland had gone to help his father with something, I called my client in Seattle and confirmed the details of a contract I had been negotiating for 3 months. $420,000, managed over 2 years. my largest to date. I did not tell Dorothea. I just kept the listing in my desk drawer as a souvenir. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you know exactly what that silence feels like. It is not defeat. It is a very specific kind of fuel. The second incident was at Elliot's 4th birthday party, held at Roland's parents' house at Dorothea's insistence. She had organized everything, the catering, the entertainment, the guest list, with the efficiency of someone establishing jurisdiction. When my own mother arrived and Dorothea greeted her with, "You must be so proud of how settled Nadia has become," my mother, God love her, looked at me with an expression I can only describe as a question mark wrapped in a blazer. Later, when I was helping clean up, Dorothea stood beside me at the kitchen sink and said, very casually, that she hoped I wasn't putting too much pressure on Roland's career expectations by having ambitions that stretch the household thin. I handed her a rinsed plate. I smiled. I had that morning finalized the paperwork on a property investment that would triple in value over the following 6 years. I said, "I'll keep that in mind." She touched her brooch. I dried my hands and went to find my son. The third incident is the one that made me understand what kind of war this actually was. Cecile, Roland's grandmother, Elliot's great-grandmother, the woman who built everything, had a ring. Not a simple ring. A piece her own mother had brought from Lagos in 1948, reset twice over the decades, but always kept in the family, always meant to pass down the direct line. When Elliot was 6, Cecile called Roland and me to her home in Westchester on a Sunday afternoon and told us with her characteristic directness that she was revising her estate planning and she wanted us to understand her intentions. The ring was going to Elliot. Not to Roland, not to Felicia, not to any of the cousins, to Elliot specifically, because, Cecile said, looking at me over her reading glasses, he is the continuation of something I care about more than sentiment. And his mother will know how to protect it. She was, at that point, 81 years old, entirely sharp and completely serious. We sat with her estate attorney for 2 hours that afternoon. The ring would be held in a properly structured trust, with Roland as the named trustee and me as the successor trustee, until Elliot reached the age of 25. The terms were explicit. Nobody could access, sell, transfer, or remove the ring from the trust without both trustee approval and the written consent of Cecile's estate attorney, a meticulous woman named Josephine Adler-Chang who had been handling Cecile's affairs for 15 years. Cecile handed me a copy of the trust document before we left. She squeezed my hand. "You're the careful one," she said. "I've always known it." Dorothea was not at that meeting. She was told about it afterward. Roland called her on the drive home. I could hear, even from my side of the car, the quality of the silence that followed. Then her voice, very measured. "I see." She touched her brooch, I imagine. From 40 miles away, I'm almost certain she touched her brooch. Roland died unexpectedly 19 months later. A cardiac event, sudden, the kind that allows no preparation and no negotiation. He was 43 years old, and we had been the kind of married that meant I had to learn an entirely new shape for every ordinary day. Elliot was 8. He asked me, the morning after, whether we would still have pancakes on Sundays. I said yes. I meant it as a promise to both of us. The grief is not the story I'm telling right now, and I won't dress it up with details it doesn't need. What it is relevant to say is this. Roland's death changed the legal architecture of the trust. As successor trustee, I stepped into the primary trustee role automatically. Josephine Adler-Chang sent me a formal letter confirming this within 2 weeks of Roland's death. The ring remained in the trust, in a secured vault at a facility Cecile's estate had contracted. The ring was safe. The paperwork was clean. I was, legally speaking, the only person with authority over that asset. Dorothea did not see it that way. In the months after Roland died, she began what I can only describe as a sustained, patient campaign to position herself as the appropriate authority on everything Hartley-related, including and especially Elliot. She was not aggressive about it. She was never aggressive. That wasn't her style. She was present. She was helpful. She arrived with casseroles and opinions and the quiet implication that grief had probably overwhelmed my decision-making capacity, and wasn't it lucky that she was there to help? She referred to the family's assets in conversations that didn't require her to. She asked Josephine Adler-Chang twice, in those first 6 months, whether the trust arrangements might be revisited given the changed circumstances. Josephine told me about both calls. Each time, Josephine had explained with her characteristic professional patience that the trust was not subject to revision at the request of non-parties. Dorothea had thanked her politely. She had not stopped. She volunteered to store the ring. This is the part that people, when I tell this story, find most difficult to understand. Why would I ever say yes to that? And the honest answer is, I didn't say yes quickly, and I didn't say yes without conditions, and the conditions were what mattered. Let me explain the context precisely, because it matters enormously. Cecile died 14 months after Roland. She was 83, and she died peacefully, and she left behind an estate that her attorney had already organized with military precision. The ring remained in the vault, exactly where it had been. But in the weeks surrounding Cecile's death and the estate settlement process, there was a period of significant administrative activity. Accounts being closed, properties being assessed, documents being cataloged. And during that period, Josephine Adler-Chang's firm was handling an extraordinary volume of work. She asked me, in a conversation that I remember with perfect clarity, whether I had a preference for the ring's physical location during the settlement period, noting that it could remain in the vault, be transferred to my custody, or be temporarily held by a named family member if I preferred that for sentimental reasons given the circumstances. I said it could stay in the vault. That was my answer. That is what I said. Dorothea, at the funeral reception for Cecile, a separate reception from the one I will describe later, a precursor, almost a rehearsal, stood up and announced to the assembled family that she would be taking custody of the ring during the estate settlement period, as she had discussed this with the trustee and arrangements had been made. She said it in front of Roland's aunt, 3 cousins, Felicia, and Josephine Adler-Chang herself. Josephine looked at me across the room. I gave her the smallest shake of my head. She excused herself to make a phone call. I did not cause a scene at Cecile's funeral reception. I did not correct Dorothea in front of the family. What I did the following morning was call Josephine and ask her to begin building a comprehensive documentation record. Every communication, every request, every deviation from the trust terms. I also called a second attorney, a woman named Renée Solis, who specialized in trust litigation and whom I had known professionally for 4 years, and I asked her to review the trust documents and advise me on contingency options. "You think it's going to escalate," Renée said. It wasn't a question. "Document everything," she said. "Every single thing." I did. What I discovered over the following months required the kind of patience that only works if you understand that patience is not the same as inaction. I was not waiting. I was building. The ring did not stay in the vault. Somehow, and the how took Renée and Josephine 3 months to fully reconstruct, Dorothea had obtained a key to the vault facility through a contact she had cultivated during Cecile's estate settlement. The contact was a junior administrator at the estate management firm who had been led to believe, through a series of careful misrepresentations, that Dorothea had authorization to access the ring for inventory purposes. The administrator, who was 24 years old and new to the job and not the villain of this story, had documented the access in a standard log. The ring left the vault on a Thursday afternoon in April, approximately 8 months after Cecile's death. Dorothea had it in her possession for 11 days before she sold it. The jeweler was a private dealer in Manhattan. The sale price was $1.8 million. The documentation trail, which René's investigative contact pieced together over 6 weeks, showed that the funds were wired to a personal account of Dorothea's within 48 hours of the sale. By the time I knew all of this with certainty, Dorothea had already spent a significant portion of it. The cosmetic surgery was not a single procedure, it was a series of them, scheduled over 4 months, at a clinic in Palm Beach. I know this because Felicia told me not to betray her mother, but because she thought I already knew during a phone call in which she said, almost offhandedly, "I guess the recovery from the procedures is going better." When I asked her which procedures she meant, the quality of the silence that followed told me she had just realized she had said something she wasn't supposed to say. Felicia is not a bad person. She is a person who loved her mother and was afraid of her at the same time, which is its own particular kind of captivity. She had known about the ring sale for 2 months before that phone call. She had told herself it would be sorted out privately. She had been waiting for someone to sort it out. I understood that about her, and I did not blame her for it, though I also could not pretend it hadn't happened. I called René the same evening. "We have enough," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "we have enough." I want to be precise about what enough meant at that point because the word sounds simple and it was anything but. What Renee and I had assembled, over 6 months of careful, methodical work, was this: the complete trust documentation establishing Elliot's ownership of the ring, the vault access log showing the unauthorized removal, a chain of financial records tracing the sale proceeds, testimony from the junior administrator at the estate firm, and a recorded conversation, legally obtained, conducted by Renee's investigative contact, in which Dorothea, when asked about the ring in what appeared to be a casual social context, said that she had made a decision that was in the family's best interest and that a child that age doesn't understand what he has. That last sentence. I have listened to that recording more times than I can count. Not out of pain, I was past pain by then, but because it contained, in 12 words, everything I needed anyone else to understand about what Dorothea believed she was. She believed she was the arbiter. She believed she had the right. She believed that her judgment superseded a legal trust, a dead woman's explicit wishes, and the property rights of my son, because she was Dorothea Quan Hartley, and she had spent 30 years being the person who decided things. Renee filed the criminal complaint on a Wednesday. She filed the civil action on the same day. Josephine Adlerchang submitted the trust violation documentation to the court the following Monday. We were systematic, we were surgical, and we timed everything, and this was Renee's specific recommendation, which I followed completely, to coincide with Cecile's memorial gathering. The family had planned a second, larger reception in Cecile's memory, 6 months after the estate had settled, for the extended family and the friends who hadn't been able to travel for the original funeral. It would be the largest gathering of the Hartley family in years. 43 people, minimum. Dorothea would be there. Josephine would be there. And I would be there, with a letter in an envelope in the inside pocket of my jacket, which Renee had prepared and Josephine had reviewed, and which I had read so many times I could have recited it from memory. Elliot was staying with my mother that day. He was 11. He knew something important was happening because children always know, but I had told him only that there was a grown-up situation being handled, and that I would explain everything to him when it was done, in words that were true and appropriate for an 11-year-old, which is a standard I held myself to very carefully. He hugged me before I left and said, "You're going to be okay, Mom." I held on to that for the entire drive. The close calls in the months before the memorial were exactly the kind that test your composure and confirm your strategy. The first happened at Felicia's birthday dinner, approximately 6 weeks before the memorial. There were 14 people at the table, and somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, Dorothea's brother, a man named Gerald Quan, who had been present at every family gathering for 20 years without ever saying anything I found useful, looked at me and said, "Nadia, I heard you've been in touch with Cecile's attorney about the estate matters. Everything sorted." He meant it as small talk. He had absolutely no idea what he was walking into. I looked at him. I took a sip of water. "There are a few administrative details still being finalized," I said. "You know how estates are." He nodded. Dorothea mentioned she'd been helping coordinate. Good of her to step up. From the other end of the table, Dorothea's fingertips found her brooch. "She's been very involved," I said. My voice was completely level. "I appreciate that she cares so much about Cecile's wishes." The thing about a sentence like that is the way it sits differently in the room depending on who's listening. Gerald heard reassurance. Dorothea heard something else. I watched her hand drop from her brooch and settle flat on the tablecloth, and I kept my eyes on Gerald and smiled and changed the subject to his recent trip to Portugal, which he was delighted to discuss at length. Later, in the parking lot, Felicia caught up with me at my car. She looked like she hadn't slept well in weeks. "Nadia," she said, and then stopped. She tried again. "I want you to know that I never thought it was right." She pulled at the hem of her coat. "I want you to know I said so." I looked at her for a moment. "I know you did," I said, and I meant it. She had said so to her mother, which Renee's notes confirmed because Dorothea had mentioned it dismissively in the recorded conversation. "You did what you could, Felicia." She looked like she might cry. I didn't have the capacity to manage anyone else's emotions that evening, so I squeezed her arm and drove home. The second close call was more dangerous, and it happened in Josephine's office, of all places, 3 weeks before the memorial. Dorothea had requested a meeting with Josephine to discuss, And I am reading directly from Josephine's notes here, the long-term custody arrangements for the remaining Hartley estate assets. Josephine, who had already been fully briefed on everything Riene and I had documented, handled the meeting with the composure of someone who has spent 20 years watching people underestimate what lawyers actually know. She told me about it that evening. Dorothea had come to that meeting with documents. Specifically, she had brought a letter, which she claimed Cecile had written shortly before her death, indicating that Dorothea was to have discretionary authority over family heirlooms during the period of estate settlement. The letter was not in Cecile's estate file. It had not been witnessed. The signature, Josephine noted to me with characteristic understatement, presented certain inconsistencies with Mrs. Hartley's documented signature from the same period. "She brought a forged letter to your office," I said. "She brought a document," Josephine said carefully, "that I advised her I would need to have reviewed by a document specialist before it could be considered in any proceeding." She paused. "She took the document back before leaving." I sat with that for a moment. She took it back. She said she wanted to have it notarized first. There are moments when the scale of what someone is willing to do becomes completely, irreversibly clear. I had known, intellectually, that Dorothea had committed a serious crime. I had understood the legal dimensions of it for months, but sitting in Josephine's office, hearing about a forged letter, I felt something shift, not into anger exactly, but into a kind of absolute certainty. Whatever reserve of measured patience I had been drawing on for the past 4 years consolidated into something harder and more final. I called Riene from the parking garage. "She brought a forged document to Josephine's office," I said. "I want everything filed before the memorial." Riene was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "I'll call you tonight with the filing confirmation," she said. She called at 9:47 that evening. Everything was filed. The criminal complaint, the civil action, the trust violation documentation, the request for an emergency asset freeze on Dorothea's accounts pending the outcome of the civil proceedings. The wheels were turning. They could not be stopped. I stood in my kitchen after that call and looked at the photograph on the refrigerator, Elliot at the beach last summer, squinting into the sun, holding up a shell he'd found like it was treasure, and I thought about Cecile squeezing my hand and calling me the careful one. I thought about an 83-year-old woman who had built something real and wanted it to mean something, and a child who had inherited not just a ring but the intention behind it, the love embedded in a legal document that said, "This child matters, this is his, protect it." I was going to protect it. The memorial was in 3 days, 43 people, a room full of Hartleys and their history and their careful silences. And me, with an envelope in my jacket, and a phone that Riene could reach me on, and absolutely nothing left to lose by being exactly who I had always been. If you are still with me, stay, because what happened in that room is the reason I am telling you this story. The morning of Cecile's memorial gathering was the kind of late October day that feels staged, crisp air, sky the color of old pewter, leaves on the ground outside the Hartley family home in Connecticut that had been raked into neat borders along the driveway, because Dorothea had hired someone to rake them that way. Everything composed, everything deliberate. I parked in the circular drive behind Gerald's car and sat for a moment with my hands in my lap, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to feel the stillness before it ended. The envelope was in the inside pocket of my jacket. I had checked it twice before leaving the house. Riene had called me at 7:15 that morning to confirm that Josephine would arrive at the gathering by noon, which was the agreed signal. It was 10:47. I went inside. The house smelled like the flowers Dorothea had ordered, white arrangements, formal, the kind that say grief without committing to it, and the caterers were moving through the main rooms with a quiet efficiency that Dorothea had probably scripted down to the walking pace. 43 people, as expected, Roland's aunts and their husbands, the cousins I'd known for 9 years and the ones I'd met twice. Family friends who had known Cecile for decades, and who greeted me with the particular warmth reserved for widows at family gatherings, which is kind and slightly suffocating, and always feels like being gently held underwater. Felicia found me within 4 minutes of my arriving. She looked the way she had been looking for 6 weeks, like someone who hadn't decided yet whether to cry or run. She hugged me, and over her shoulder I could see Dorothea across the room, speaking to Roland's Aunt Marguerite, her posture immaculate, her brooch catching the light. "You look good," Felicia said, pulling back. Her eyes did a quick inventory of my expression. She was looking for something, fear, hesitation, any sign that I had reconsidered. She found none of it. "Thank you," I said. "How are you?" She pressed her lips together. "I don't know yet." That was honest, and I respected it. I squeezed her arm and moved toward the drinks table, keeping Dorothea in my peripheral vision the way you track weather. For the first hour, the gathering moved through its expected rhythms. People spoke about Cecile in the past tense with the mixture of grief and relief that follows the death of someone who lived very fully and very long. Gerald Quan told a story about Cecile at a family Christmas in 1991 that made 3 people laugh and 1 person tear up. Roland's Aunt Marguerite showed someone a photograph on her phone. I spoke to people I genuinely liked and people I barely knew, and I drank a glass of water and then a glass of sparkling water. And I kept my hands steady, and my voice warm and my attention divided precisely between the room and the door. Dorothea worked the gathering with the expertise of someone who had been hosting things like this for 30 years. She moved from cluster to cluster, touching elbows, accepting condolences for her own loss with the appropriate measure of composed grief, playing the role of the family's emotional anchor with the ease of long practice. Twice, I saw her glance at me from across the room with an expression I had learned to read over 9 years. It was assessment. She was checking the temperature, measuring what I knew, calculating what, if anything, had changed since the last time she had seen me. Both times, I smiled at her. Both times, she looked away first. At 11:42, Dorothea tapped her glass and the room gathered itself toward her. She stood near the fireplace, Cecile's fireplace, the one she'd had rebuilt in 2003 after the original chimney cracked, and she spoke about her mother-in-law with a fluency and warmth that was, I will admit, genuinely skilled. She talked about what Cecile had built, what she had meant to the family, what her legacy was. She used the word legacy 4 times. She talked about the importance of honoring her memory through the choices the family made going forward. Then she said it. She had clearly planned to say it. It came too smoothly, too positioned in the middle of a paragraph that had been building toward it for it to have been spontaneous. She said that in considering Cecile's wishes and the best interests of the family, she had made some decisions about certain estate matters that she believed Cecile herself would have endorsed, and that one of those decisions involved a particular piece. She called it the Lagos ring, which was not its name, which was not anything Cecile had ever called it, that she had determined needed to be managed differently. Given that the intended recipient was, she said, touching her brooch with 2 fingers. Far too young to appreciate what he had. The room shifted. I felt it before I heard it, a slight adjustment in the quality of the attention around me, people glancing at each other, glancing at me. Dorothea looked directly at me then, for the first time that morning. She had the expression of someone who believes they have already won and is giving the other person a chance to acknowledge it gracefully. It was, I think, a form of mercy in her own mind. She was giving me the opportunity to accept what had been decided in front of everyone so there would be no confusion going forward. I reached into my jacket and took out the envelope. The room noticed. Rooms always notice when someone produces a document at a family gathering. The conversation didn't stop exactly, but it thinned, fewer words, lower voices, more attention directed toward the fireplace. I walked to where Josephine Adler-Chang was standing near the doorway to the hallway. She had arrived at 12 minutes past noon, as planned, and had been standing with a glass of water and a presence so professionally neutral that most people in the room probably assumed she was a family friend they simply hadn't met yet. I handed her the envelope. She opened it, read the 2 pages inside with the unhurried pace of someone who already knew exactly what they said, and then she straightened the pages and looked at the room and said, in a carrying, precise voice, I apologize for the interruption. My name is Josephine Adler-Chang, and I am the attorney of record for the Acaffer-Hartley estate. I have a legal matter that requires me to address this gathering, and I would ask for 5 minutes of your attention. The room went from thin to completely, absolutely focused. Dorothea set down her glass with too much force, a small sound, but sharp. Her hand stayed on the stem for a moment, then she lifted it away deliberately. Josephine, she said, her voice carrying exactly the right note of gracious confusion, this is hardly the setting for. The document Mrs. Hartley, Mrs. Nadia Hartley, has provided me contains a formal notification of legal action that, as a state attorney, I am required to communicate to relevant parties. Josephine looked at her paper. A criminal complaint has been filed with the Connecticut State Police for the theft and conversion of a trust asset valued at $1.8 million, specifically the ring identified in the Acafer-Hartley Trust documentation as the Lagos family ring, registered to the trust for the benefit of Elliot Roland Hartley. A civil action has also been filed in Connecticut Superior Court for the same asset. An emergency freeze order on associated accounts has been issued pending proceedings. The room did not know what to do with that sentence. I watched it travel from the people closest to Josephine, outward in rings, the way sound moves through water. I watched Roland's Aunt Marguerite look at her husband. I watched Gerald Quann's chin come forward, like he was trying to hear something he hadn't quite caught. I watched Felicia, across the room, close her eyes for exactly 3 seconds and then open them. Dorothea's hand found her brooch. She pressed it flat against her jacket, not touching it with her fingertips this time, but with her whole palm, as though she needed to feel it was still there. "That is," she started, "that is a mischaracterization of, the ring was removed from the secured vault on the 14th of April, Josephine said, calm and factual as a calendar, without trustee authorization. The trust document establishing Mrs. Nadia Hartley as successor trustee is on file with this office. The vault access log documenting the unauthorized removal is part of the filed complaint. The financial records documenting the subsequent sale to a private dealer in New York are also part of the filed complaint. I had authorization." Dorothea's voice came out even, but something behind it had shifted, a very slight increase in pitch, a tightness in the final syllable. "Cecile discussed this with me personally. She made her wishes clear, and I acted on them." I spoke then for the first time since it had started. My voice came out quieter than I expected it to, and steadier. "Cecile's wishes are in the trust document she signed with Josephine's office," I said. "They're explicit. The ring was Elliot's. It was not yours to decide." Her eyes moved to me. That assessment quality was gone. What was in its place was something rawer, not guilt, not yet, but a recalibration happening in real time, the sudden awareness that the landscape she had been navigating was not the landscape she had thought it was. "You are choosing," she said, spacing each word carefully, "to do this at Cecile's memorial, in front of her family, in front of people who loved her. You chose to announce what you'd done at Cecile's memorial," I said, "in front of her family, in front of people who loved her." I just responded. A pause, 4 full seconds where no one in the room made a sound. Gerald Quann had his hand over his mouth. Marguerite's husband had taken her hand and was holding it, not moving. Then Dorothea looked at the room, at the faces watching her, the particular quality of the attention that is not curiosity but judgment, and she said, with the control of someone who has spent decades managing how she appears, "I acted in the family's best interest. Anyone who knows how I have devoted myself to this family understands that." Felicia, from across the room, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Everyone looked at her. She was staring at her mother. Her expression was the face of someone who has known something was wrong for a long time and has just, in public, run out of the capacity to pretend otherwise. "Mom," she said, and her voice was very quiet, "you sold Elliot's ring. I made a decision about an asset that, you sold his ring." Each word landed separately. Dorothea's composure, the one she had been wearing since I walked in, since the morning began, since Cecile's memorial became the setting for this, cracked along a very specific line. Not a collapse, a fracture. She straightened almost imperceptibly, the way people do when they're trying to hold a structure together by sheer will. Her hand pressed harder on the brooch. "I would like," she said, addressing Josephine, "to speak with my own attorney before continuing this conversation." "That is absolutely your right," Josephine said. "However, I should inform you that law enforcement has been notified, and officers may be arriving within the hour, as is standard procedure following the filing of a criminal complaint of this nature." The change that moved through Dorothea's body at that sentence was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. She became very still. Her head tilted very slightly to the right, the way you tilt when you've heard something that doesn't fit the version of the world you've been operating in, and your brain is working through the implications faster than the rest of you can catch up. She looked for a moment, genuinely uncertain. Not afraid, not yet, but uncertain in a way that I had never seen on her face before in 9 years. Gerald Quann lowered his hand from his mouth. "Dorothea," he said, and then stopped, because there was nothing useful to add. "The funds," I said, "were largely spent on elective procedures. Renee Solis, my litigation attorney, has documentation of this. The civil suit is pursuing full restitution of the asset's value from all recoverable sources, including the remaining balance in the account the proceeds were deposited to. I looked directly at her. We have the financial records. We have the vault access log. We have a recorded conversation in which you described making a decision you believed was in the family's best interest. Josephine's office has already submitted a document to the court that you brought to their offices in August, which presented certain inconsistencies that a specialist has since evaluated. This is where she understood the full shape of it. Not just the legal complaint, not just the civil action, but the scope of what had been built. The months of documentation, the recorded conversation. The forged letter she had taken back, which had been described to a document specialist from memory and confirmed as inconsistent with Cecile's known signature. The vault access log that she had never considered anyone would obtain. The financial trail she had assumed was private. Her hand dropped from her brooch, just dropped, to her side. She looked at me with an expression that I will carry for a long time, not because it gave me satisfaction, though I would not pretend it gave me nothing, but because it was the first time in 9 years that I saw Dorothea Quan Hartley without the architecture. No composure, no calculation, no performance of the person she had spent 30 years constructing. Just a woman standing in her dead mother-in-law's house understanding, for the first time and completely, that she had lost. I want everyone to know, she said, and her voice was different now, thinner, the edges less controlled, that I have always done what I believed was right for this family. Nobody responded. Not one person in that room offered her the confirmation she was reaching for. Roland's Aunt Marguerite looked at her coffee cup. Gerald looked at the floor. The caterers had stopped moving. Felicia was crying quietly, not making any sound, tears on her cheeks, her arms wrapped around herself. The doorbell rang at 12:43. 2 Connecticut State police officers. Josephine met them at the door. I stood where I was, in the center of Cecile's living room, among 41 people who were very still, and I watched Dorothea Quan Hartley gather what remained of her composure with the same practiced efficiency she had always brought to everything, and walk toward the door. She paused once in the archway. She turned and looked at me. "You should have talked to me," she said. "We could have handled this privately." My hands had stopped shaking. I hadn't even realized they'd been shaking until they stopped. A very slight tremor that had been running through my fingers since I walked into the house, finally released. I let out a slow breath. "There was nothing private about selling my son's inheritance," I said, "and you made sure of that when you announced it in this room." She turned and walked through the archway. The officers were professional and quiet. Josephine spoke with them for several minutes in the entrance hall. Gerald went to stand near Felicia, which was the right instinct and the most useful thing he had done in years. Marguerite asked the caterers if there was more tea, which was her particular way of managing catastrophic situations, and I respected it. I sat down in the armchair near the window, Cecile's armchair, the one she always took at gatherings, the one nobody ever sat in out of habit and deference, and I let myself simply be in the room. My phone showed a message from Renee. "Confirmed with Josephine, everything is in order." Below it, a message from my mother. "Elliot says to tell you he finished his homework." That one I held on to for a long moment. Felicia came and sat on the footstool beside me. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "I should have said something sooner." "Yes," I said, because she should have, and because she knew it, and because pretending otherwise wouldn't have been kind, it would have been patronizing. "But you said it today." She looked at her hands. "What happens now?" "The legal process happens," I said. "It takes time, but it's going." She nodded slowly. After another moment she said quietly, "Elliot, is he okay?" "He's with my mother, he's fine, he doesn't know the details yet." I paused. "When the time is right, I'll explain it to him in a way that's appropriate, that she made a mistake, that it's being handled, that his great-grandmother's ring was important and mattered, and that I protected it for him." Felicia pressed her lips together. "Will you be able to get it back?" "The ring itself, no," I said. "It was sold to a private dealer. Recovering the physical piece would require the dealer's cooperation and litigation that could run for years with uncertain outcome. But the value, $1.8 million, that is the target of the civil recovery. Renee is confident we'll recover the majority." I looked at her steadily. "Elliot's trust will be made whole. That was always the priority." The officers left with Dorothea shortly after 1 o'clock. She was not handcuffed in front of the family. Josephine had coordinated with the responding officers beforehand, and there was a quiet professionalism to it that I had specifically requested, because whatever Dorothea had done, the people in that room did not need a performance. She left carrying her purse and her coat, and she did not look at anyone else as she walked out, and the door closed behind her, and the house held 41 people in a very profound silence that lasted, I think, almost a full minute before Marguerite asked if anyone needed more tea, and the room slowly, cautiously, began to breathe again. The formal arrest had already been processed by the time I drove home that afternoon. Renee called at 3:20 to confirm. Dorothea was charged with first-degree larceny and conversion of trust property, both felonies under Connecticut law. Bail was set at $250,000. Her brother Gerald posted it. She was out by evening, but the charges remained, the court date was set, and the civil proceeding was moving on its own track entirely. Josephine filed the complete trust violation documentation with the court the following week. Renee's civil suit named Dorothea individually and also named the estate management firm where the junior administrator had, through misrepresentation, been induced to provide vault access. That firm settled within 6 weeks, their insurer paying out $410,000 into a designated account for Elliot's trust. The civil judgment against Dorothea personally took 8 months to finalize. The court awarded full restitution of the ring's appraised value, $1.8 million, plus legal costs. Of that, approximately $900,000 was recoverable from her remaining assets after the account freeze. The rest was structured as a civil judgment that will follow her financial record indefinitely. The criminal case resolved 11 months after the memorial. Dorothea entered an Alford plea to 1 count of first-degree larceny, which under Connecticut statute carries a sentence of up to 20 years. Her attorney negotiated 4 years probation, mandatory restitution payments drawn against the civil judgment, and a permanent record. The private dealer who had purchased the ring was contacted during the investigation. He had already resold it to an overseas buyer, which is why physical recovery was not pursued, but his documentation of the purchase, which had been conducted without proper provenance verification, became part of the investigative record, and his business faced its own regulatory review as a result. Felicia and I still speak. Not often and not easily, but we speak. She attended 2 of the court proceedings. She did not attend her mother's plea hearing. What she said to me afterward in a brief phone call was, "I'm sorry it took me so long to say something." I told her what I believed, that she had been in an impossible position and she had eventually done the right thing, and that counted. I meant it. The Hartley family, as a unit, reorganized itself quietly around the absence of the person who had believed herself to be its center. Marguerite stepped into the role that Dorothea had occupied, with considerably less calculation and considerably more warmth. Gerald sends birthday cards to Elliot every year. The cousins are, as cousins tend to be, variable. Dorothea sold her Connecticut house 18 months after the plea. The sale was necessary to meet the first year of restitution payments. She moved to a smaller property in a suburb I don't need to know the name of. I heard through Felicia, without asking, that she had stopped wearing the pearl brooch. I don't know what to do with that information, so I set it down. Elliot is 12 now. He knows, in the terms appropriate for a 12-year-old, what happened, that his great-grandmother Cecile loved him and left him something important, that someone made the wrong choice about it, and that I made sure the wrong choice had consequences. He knows the trust has been largely restored. He knows the ring itself is gone, and he asked me once, matter-of-factly, whether that made me sad. I said yes, a little. He said, "Well, you still have the picture of it." He was talking about a photograph Cecile had included in the estate documentation, the ring on her mother's hand, Lagos, 1948, which I had framed and put in the hallway of our house. He notices it sometimes, on the way to school. That, I think, is the thing that matters, that it is still there, in the form it can take. I don't think about Dorothea often. When I do, it is not with the heat I expected to feel after all of it. It is with something more like a clear-eyed recognition of what she was and what she cost herself. She had spent 30 years believing that she controlled the story of the Hartley family, that her judgment superseded paperwork and legal trusts and the wishes of a woman who had earned everything she had. She had been wrong about every part of that, and the proof of it is now part of a court record in Hartford County that will outlast all of us. The morning after the memorial, I had driven to my mother's house and told Elliot that it was handled. He looked at me for a moment and then said, "Can we make pancakes?" We made pancakes. That was enough. So, did I go too far, or not nearly far enough? I have been told both by people I respect, and I genuinely want to know where you land.